Okay, here we are with the Professor Bauer. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here. And in this interview, I wanted to ask to you some questions that are not only focused on what you do, but how you do. Maybe if there's some inspiration behind all of the things that you do. And I hope that with these questions, something that can inspire young naturalists, zoologists, and more precisely, pathologists can grow up. The first questions are about the history of herpetology. More precisely, if you find in this history something important that inspired you. More precisely, I wanted to say that you are a distinguished expert in the history of pathology, of course, and it's quite closely tied to the history of science and is shifting paradigms. In studying the journals and writings of past naturalists, have you encountered any methods, approaches, or ideas that were abandoned over time but still hold value today? Or perhaps insights from these historical texts have inspired your own methods and philosophy, even in the absence of a direct mentor?
Well, I think a very general issue that would apply here is you go back to the historical record and people were generalists, right? They had to be generalists because not that much was known. And if you went to the field or you were exploring in some area, you had to know a little bit about everything. And I think that's something that is become harder for us to do as we become more and more focused on a particular interest or a particular taxonomic group. And it's also, I think, something that's easy for people to lose sight of because today you can use your cell phone and you can find out whatever you want wherever you are. And the idea of being prepared for everything, I think, is something that has been a little bit lost over time. And I think that this is really something that one gets when one goes back and looks at the historical record. You see how many of these people were not only herpetologists, but they were botanists and entomologists at the same time. And if I look in my own experience, of all of the master's students I've had, Villanova specializes in masters, and in all of the master's programs, students that I've had in the program, the one that was the most productive as a student, who got 13 papers out in a 2-year master's, was a woman who did just that. She went to the field and she knew what wasn't known. She kind of knew what was out there, and she knew enough that when she saw something interesting, she acted on it. She recorded the data. So she didn't just focus on her own project, but she was open enough and knowledgeable enough about what had gone before to be able to say, I don't think people have seen that. I'm going to record that. And that allowed her to be very productive, not only in her own project, but in many side projects that most students maybe wouldn't be prepared for. They know their own group, but they might see something that, let's say, a mammal does in the field or a bird is doing, and they don't, that's outside their area, so they don't know that that's interesting or that might be important. So I think in a very general sense, it's not a specific technique, but I think it's sort of a kind of a worldview that has largely been lost, was this idea of being very prepared, not so much in our own separate silos where we know everything about one small area, but to know enough about what we're likely to see to be able to take advantage of that. So I think that's maybe the thing that I would highlight as being the thing that one sees again and again, let's say in 18th or 19th century biologists or field biologists, that is something that we today could and should benefit from. I think being a little bit more open to these wider questions rather than specifically only focusing on our own projects. Of course, it's a lot of work to do that, but that preparedness, see it when you look at kind of great explorers. You look at the books that Darwin took with him on the voyage of the Beagle. You look at those sorts of things, and nobody just took books in their tiny area of interest. They took everything: geology, botany, zoology, all sorts of things. And the world, of course, is a lot more complex today, and there's a lot more to know. But I think we would benefit from that sort of approach of taking a wider view, stepping back, and having a wider view, so that when we do see things, we can appreciate when things might be interesting, when things might be new.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Yes, more you go in the past, and more impressive is this point of view. For example, Goethe from Germany was a philosopher, but also a great writer, but a botanist at the same time.
Right. Goethe is a fantastic example, publishing on the segmentation of the vertebrate skull, and there are modern examples, even broader, outside of science. Paulo Vanzolini from Brazil, who I know as a great herpetologist, but I was speaking to somebody once years ago, and they knew him only as a musician. They didn't know that he was a scientist. So, a lot of the people who really make an impact have these very broad interests.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring. And the other question, so if we talk about a way of living of past naturalists, so an important question to ask to ourselves is if you have uncovered any lesser known pathologies or naturalists whose lives or works could serve as an inspiration for contemporary naturalists. Perhaps figures who, like Darwin and Wallace, led adventurous lives and left behind autographies or travel diaries that deserve more recognition, so we can read how they used to think. Maybe one more specific person.
Well, of course, Darwin and Wallace had the benefit of writing in English at the time that English was becoming more and more kind of the language of science at the time. But there are certainly, I think, a lot of people who wrote in other languages who may be known more on a national level, but don't have the international recognition that they might have. So I can think of a few people that would be worth mentioning. One of the people that I did my first historical work on was Wilhelm Peters from Berlin. And I think what's interesting about somebody like that, and it applies to Darwin and Wallace as well, is here is somebody who went for about 5 years to Mozambique. And he was there in the 1840s and 50s when European influence there was very limited. There was no infrastructure. More or less left Germany and went around the world, not knowing really what he was going to get into. And the reason why I like Peters, or I think he's an interesting person in this regard, is he actually did that work, and then he came back and spent his career as the curator and later the director of the museum in Berlin. So in some ways, he is sort of a complete personality. He had the exploration, but then he had the remainder of his career to work on his material, to see the value of it, to sort of expand on that, and to some extent, I think we're drawn to we're kind of drawn to people who have, who make these but often other people then write up those sorts of things. And it's not to take anything away from Darwin, but if we look at herpetology and we look at Darwin, the Herpetology of the Beagle was written by Thomas Bell, and he used notes from Darwin, but Darwin himself was a big ideas person and was not focusing so much on these smaller issues. And somebody like Peters was interested in both the small ideas, the details, publishing what he saw, and he worked both on mammals and reptiles as well as insects and fish and everything else, but especially reptiles and mammals. And somebody like that who recorded in his diaries his time in Mozambique, I think provides some interesting insight. The other thing that sort of would separate somebody like him is, if you think of Darwin again, Darwin's movements were largely dictated by other people because he was going where the beagle went. And so he had to adapt to that, which is important in and of itself. But Peters, and the same sort of applies to Wallace as well, went someplace and had to figure it all out himself. He decided where he was going to go, where he was going to stay. So there's a little bit more of I don't want to, again, say that Darwin wasn't an independent explorer or thinker, but these are people who really were thrown into the deep end. They were put into a place and they had to figure everything out themselves. So I think one gets some interesting insight from what they've done. I think other people, just to mention a few others that I think would be useful for people, are Prince Maximilian, who went both to Brazil and to the United States in the early 1800s. And he was somebody who was wealthy and sort of was able to sort of have the best of things when he was in the field. But he was also interested in ethnography and in other aspects of the people and the places that he went to. And his work is one that's probably not as well known as it should be. It was written in German. It has been translated into other languages, but I think you can ask 1,000 people on the street, do you know who Darwin is? And they would know. And if you ask, do you know who Prince Maximilian of Neuwied was? And they probably would not know. But he's one. And then there are some others that I've been dealing with lately as an editor, which are the many people that worked for the Dutch East Indies Commission that went to Indonesia, what is today Indonesia, in the 1820s and later, most of whom died after only just a very short period in the field. They died of malaria or other tropical diseases. But some of those people in their short lives were incredibly productive and not only discovered a lot, but wrote letters back to Europe where they sent the descriptions and they described what they were experiencing. And those are people who sort of gave their lives for their science and who are probably underappreciated as well. Kuhl and Van Hasselt, Heinrich Boy, so a number of different people, mostly from the Netherlands and from Germany, who participated in these expeditions. And I'm quite happy now that there are not only the book that I'm editing, but at least one or two other books are coming out shining a light on these sorts of people. But I think I'd be hard pressed to think of to select just one person. And if I did, it might be somebody like Peters, but that's because I've worked on him and I know him best. You know, it's somebody that I've interacted with. But I do think that just in general, people today do not pay that much attention to the historical components, and they sort of think, well, this is all useless today. This is all things that happened 100 or 200 years ago. What are we going to get from this today? And I think if nothing else, if you look at these people and you look at the level of hardship that they functioned under versus what we do today, these are people that really, going on a field trip was risking your life. Almost, in the case of the Dutch East Indies Commission, most of them did lose their lives going to the field. So I think that you see when you read these people's diaries or you read their publications, you see their commitment to the science, which is something that, even if the science is outdated, is something we can take from reading these. We get a sense of the level of passion that people had, the willingness they had to put themselves in danger just to learn about the natural world. And I think people today might ask themselves, would I go on that field trip if I knew there was a 70% chance that I would never make it back? I think, many people today wouldn't think of going on a field trip without their cell phone, for example, and I'm old enough that when I was a student on my field trips, I had to fly someplace. I didn't have to take a boat for months, but I flew someplace, and then I really had no contact. It was very difficult to get a hold of people. And of course, when you go to these historical works, you see people who really were in remote places, who really were on their own, and who were willing to make these sacrifices. And I think that that's something that, it's hard to summarize in a paragraph, but you read somebody's diary or you read somebody's major work from their expeditions, and you get this sense of passion for the science.
Yes, sometimes when you study history, but not only about science, like also for art, you have the impressions that nowadays we use a specific technique for painting, and we don't need, and we not even think about why we are using this kind of color and not another color. And then we discover, by reading an autobiography of an old painter in the 17th century, that maybe that color resemble an emotional state that made you able to understand deeply what you're doing right now. And that makes a huge separation between what you think you're doing and what you actually do.
Oh, it's a very good point.
And so thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's it's very important. And another question, all of the naturalists you told about, they use to publish in their own language, so German, Dutch, and French, and English. Okay. They started to use English only in this second part of the 19th century?
Yeah, I mean, really, certainly if you look through the history of herpetology in particular, but of natural history in general, you see, of course, at first you see Latin being the language, then you see French being the international language, and eventually you see English being the international language. But to a large extent, I think you don't really see the people publishing all that much in their own languages until really after the first quarter of the 20th century. So certainly most German authors were publishing in German up through that part, and even later, of course. And people in smaller countries with languages that they knew might not be so well known made the effort to publish in some other language, a second language. But it raises another question, which is, I think to people today, herpetologists today, have to recognize that we as responsible scientists, we need to know what came before. So just because somebody published in Russian or Chinese or whatever language doesn't mean that we can ignore that it exists, which is a sort of, I don't want to paint the picture too broadly, but certainly I've known a lot of students who they see something in a language they don't read, they almost make believe it exists because they can't read that language. And of course, today there's no excuse. Google Translate and various things. We have access to all of this. And I think it's especially interesting because a lot of this, when you read what somebody wrote in their own language, you get more from it than what the translation gives. The translation is sometimes very accurate, but you lose the spirit of how the thing was written. And
with the jokes, it's
and it's a difficult thing. I mean, I know for languages that I can read, like German, if I read Faust, let's say in German, I have to read it twice. I have to read it once for what it says in German, but then I have to read it again for the way that it's said, for the flow that you would only get in the German version, not in any translation. So I think, I like to think that languages are an important skill for biologists because it opens up the older literature to you, and allows you, especially dealing with this historical literature, allows you to really get a much more meaningful sense of what these people were feeling when they were writing this and how they viewed the world, which gets a little bit sanitized when it's translated into another language.
Yes, just for finishing these questions, because after every question, I have other 1,000 questions. So, but every single language has its own words that can be translated to other language. For example, in Norwegian, there's a trollskeim, that it's a word that means the first love that is totally irrational. That's a specific word for that. No other languages. Russian has pravda, that is the truth, but the truth of someone, of the people, is another word. Pravda is the real truth that no one can see. How can you translate it? Thank you very much. So, if we can move more specifically on your work with animals, I was particularly fascinated by the elusive technique of the gecko, Geckolepis, you described, that quite shocked you. So in your career, have you encountered other unique or remarkable adaptation, whether behavioral, escape-related, or tied to mimicry, that have left a lasting impression on you? Many of these specializations, I imagine, remain unknown to most of your colleagues or to the public. So could you share one or more examples that had a profound emotional impact on you and that you feel deserve a greater recognition?
Okay, well, I'll start by saying something about the integumentary loss that Geckolepis does, and a bunch of other things. And the first time I saw that was actually in Aileronix in the Seychelles. And that had a huge impact on me because I went to grab this Aileronix and I was left with a handful of skin, and it immediately struck me, I knew that they did this. I knew that they would lose skin, and yet it was still an effective escape mechanism. So if you were a naive predator, just think how successful that would be how shocked you are when suddenly the animal runs away. So that was a particularly impactful one for me. And also that was on my first really big field trip to the Seychelles and to Southern Africa when I was a postdoc. So that one had a big impact. I think some of the other things which people may know about, or they would have seen on YouTube or something like that, are the tail squirting mechanism that is used by Stropurus and by Urodactylodes, where you have the ejection of this material, and it had been studied from a biochemical viewpoint. What is it that they are producing? but we still don't know a lot about it. And that particular behavior is one that I've worked on in terms of its morphology, and I understand its morphology. But the thing that really had an impact on me is thinking about, how does that evolve? I understand how it works, but how do you go from a normal lizard tail to a tail that's full of glands that can secrete something that squirts out onto a potential predator? So that is something that I think over my career has really affected me, was thinking more about how these things might evolve. And I just returned 2 days ago from South Africa and was at the Herpetological Association of Africa meetings, and I saw somebody else's work there on frogs, which really also had me thinking since I saw the talk. It was about Central African frogs that eat a particular sort of leaf that self-medicates and causes them to expel worms from their gut. How did that evolve? How did those frogs figure out, so to speak, that eating that particular leaf would have a benefit for them? So this is a sort of behavioral adaptation of this particular group, of this particular species of frog. And that really, got me, again, thinking about these complex adaptations. The adaptations in and of themselves are interesting from a biomechanical sense, or from a morphological sense, or from a developmental sense. But that's probably kind of where my research interest mostly lies. But I am still very fascinated by how you get to that point. What is the selective factor that causes these sorts of things to happen? And it's something that I think we function at two different levels. As scientists, we ask questions that are, how is something built? How does it differ? How can we compare these things? But we rarely ask the question about how this actually evolved. There are some, of course, well-known examples where people ask about how things evolve, but many of these specific examples, how we got from this point, a normal lizard, let's say, to one that sheds its scales, or one that squirts material from the tails. How do we get to that point? What is the selection that has acted on that? That's a really difficult thing to answer, because especially as herpetologists, we tend not to work on systems that are model systems that are easier to answer these questions with, these how did this evolve. We work on things that maybe have never been bred in captivity, have longer lifespans. We can't do the work that you would do on Drosophila, let's say, to answer a question about how selection changes and this sort of thing. So to some extent, I think that these kinds of interesting adaptations are ones that maybe more general evolutionary biologists should be thinking about. We can provide, as field biologists, we can provide lots of interesting examples of these adaptations, and then maybe somebody else whose livelihood or whose focus is on asking questions about how selection is acting, might be able to take up some of these questions to answer those more, or let's say those deeper questions of how do we get to this. But I do think that, there are many of these things that we see in the field that are really fascinating. And, for me, my original interest when I was, I guess, about 12 years old was I wrote a paper in school about integumentary derivatives in squamates and interesting things that they could do. And so I had an early interest in things like the skin shedding and like the tail squirting, which at least in part involved the integument, involved the skin and the way that that it's involved in these things. But I do think that there are many of these things that when you see them, you can read about them, but when you see them in the field and you see how effective they are for protection or predation or whatever biological activity is going on, when you actually see them in the field, it gives you a different level of appreciation for these adaptations. And I think that's kind of applies more generally. I know when I go to the field, I can read about a species, I can even write about or describe a new species, but unless I've seen it in the field, I don't really have the full appreciation of it. And once I see it, even if it's something I've only seen once, somehow seeing it in its habitat, seeing it do what it does, immediately gives you a sort of emotional understanding of that organism that you really can't have without having that level of appreciation, without seeing that. You can read all you want, and that's a big help, but you gain another level of understanding when you see these adaptations in practice.
Yes, thank you very much. You let me thought about so the problem of the scientist is the problem of the poet. No, they see a rose, a plant, whatever it is, an animal, and they start to think how to make up a poem or a painting that represent not what this animal is, but what they resemble to us. And why? Because sometimes we have the impressions that words written or not lose something which is very important. And I remember a beautiful interview to an historian of the philosophy here in Italy, Giovanni Reale, that it's an expert of Plato, was an expert of Plato. And at a certain point, they asked him how to make question to ourselves because we are not able to do it. And he said, it's an educational problem. Childs, when grow up, they always start to say, what does it mean? And you explain it. And why? And you explain. And why? And why? And why? And always at certain point, someone says, well, because things are as they are. And that's the problem. The child always wants to reach the meaning of the meanings. And you let me think about Plato.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And so, in your field work across different parts of the world, interactions with the local or indigenous population, I imagine, are inevitable sometimes. So what strategies would you recommend for effectively collaborating with these communities to enhance herpetological or broader naturalistic research? Do you believe that there is potential for connecting herpetology with ethnology or anthropology maybe, particularly given the extensive tradition knowledge often held by indigenous people?
It's a very interesting question, and I think the way that herpetologists need to approach this is a bit different than the way that, let's say, an ornithologist would, and that's because realistically, many amphibians and reptiles may not be relevant to indigenous people. If they're too small to eat, they're not something that they use in some sort of cultural way, they may not pay much attention to them, whereas, famously, Ernst Mayr in New Guinea, kind of the local people knew nearly every bird species. But when you look at it, cases where people have done ethnozoological studies on reptiles or amphibians, usually it's a smaller number that people will recognize. But having said that, interacting with local communities is always important, because from the point of view of somebody who's doing the field work, of course, you want to have access to areas that may be under local control. You want the local community to see what you're doing as a positive thing, not something that is a threat to their community or a threat to their beliefs. So I think one critical thing for interacting with local people is first step is to be very respectful of whatever local beliefs are. So sometimes people go and the local person may say, "Oh, this is poisonous," or "This is venomous," and they want to say, "No, this is perfectly safe to handle." And in a way, people feel that they're, providing education or they're enlightening people. But in fact, that's challenging a traditional view and is probably not the best thing that you can do. So you always, I think, need to keep in mind when dealing with indigenous peoples that you're a visitor where they live, and whatever you're doing should not be something that in any way is something they would see as disrespectful to their own culture or to their own beliefs. Although in many cases, when I go to the field, you experience, and this has been more and more the case over time, you encounter maybe older people who have traditional beliefs and younger people who maybe never learned those beliefs or are in conflict because they know those beliefs, but they also have heard or have read or know something else that comes from, let's say, Western science. So I think that, one really always needs to be careful of these things. And I've had this experience in New Caledonia, for example, where certain groups of people, certain clans or tribes have some animals that are taboo, that they may not speak about. They may know something about the biology, but they're not permitted to say something. So, for example, the giant geckos, Rhacodactylus, there are some tribes in New Caledonia that have them as their totem animal. And if they want to give you information about those, they are allowed to do so culturally. But the adjacent tribe may know just as much about those animals, but they are not culturally permitted to give that information to an outsider. Only the tribe that has the giant geckos as their totem, as their special animal, is allowed to decide if they want to share that information with other people. So those kinds of things are things that sometimes you don't know until you get to where you're going. You may not know what the local situation is. So I think one really needs to be very perceptive when you're interacting with people. You want to read the room. You want to get a sense what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. I don't want to say anything that is, that might be disrespectful. And I think that most people seem to recognize that you're coming from the outside and you may not know their culture that well. And I always like to sort of explain to people, there's more I need to understand about your culture. And, I apologize in advance if I say or do something that you might not appreciate. And people, I think, are usually fairly open to that. But the other part of the question, that the combining of anthropology or ethnology, I think certainly especially in those cases where there is local recognition of a species, sort of local knowledge of a particular thing, that can be used to great advantage. I've done that in a number of studies that I've done, and I certainly appreciate it when other people do that. Today, we generally think of integrative taxonomy, and when we say integrative taxonomy, we're usually thinking of, I did some molecular phylogenetics and I did morphology. But one of those integrative lines of evidence can be anthropological evidence or ethnographic evidence that is another line of evidence that may provide information about things. I think of, for example, Wolfgang Böhme in Germany is somebody that's done some interesting work where he's combined information about local belief systems with the behavior or the morphology of the organism to understand the organism in a broader context. So I think it's always a great thing if you can do it. And to me, it's especially attractive when you can combine not only morphological and molecular data or behavioral data, but ethnography, anthropology, or history as another line of evidence in the work that we do. So I certainly think it's a really important thing. And if there is an opportunity to make that connection, to find something that a local community or a group of indigenous peoples has, some knowledge they have about the organism, if that can be combined, that's really fantastic. It's been interesting, for example, working in parts of Australia, working in the Kimberley in tropical Western Australia with indigenous Australian people who have relatively less information about small lizards because they're not directly relevant to their day-to-day life, but things that are larger organisms that they're going to encounter, things that they might use as a food source. They have a great deal of information that can be useful, for example, in learning about what are the egg-laying sites of this turtle versus that turtle, or where would you find the nighttime retreat of that varanid? Where is that going to be spending its evenings? Those are kinds of things that you could figure out in the field, but people on the ground already know that, and you can learn something, and then you can go and test to make sure that the ideas that they're presenting are what you see as well. But I do think that combination of anthropology, ethnology, ethnography with our field research is incredibly useful and really fascinating, I think.
And talking about when you said in New Caledonia that like some animals can't be mentioned, it's interesting because also in the history of our words, we know that once upon a time it was similar for us because, for example, bear, like in Norwegian, I think it's bjorn. It's always the Indo-European root for saying brown, because in their culture and also in Slavic cultures, you can't mention, once upon a time, you couldn't mention bear because if you say bear, the bear arrives.
Mm-hmm.
And in Russian, it's like the Oni heater. Or something like that. And people are in different cultures, sometimes resemble what we wear or what we should be sometimes. So it's very interesting. And linguistically talking, I was thinking like in some places like New Guinea, I don't know how it's pronounced in English. New Guinea.
New Guinea, yeah.
Okay. There are a lot of languages, like it's the country with more languages on the planet. And I was struggling thinking, how can you make contact to all of these people if you have to do field research there? Maybe there's, I don't know, a national language, but some kind of people don't know the language due to the geographically and cultural factors. So how can it be possible?
It can be a real problem. I was working in northern Namibia in an area where there are Himba people, and of course I don't speak Himba, but I speak English and I speak at least a little Afrikaans, and I found somebody who spoke Afrikaans and Herero, and then somebody who could speak Herero and Himba. And so we were staying in an area, and Himba people are nomadic, so not in a village, but really sort of somebody who is herding goats and moving around, but was able to get two intermediate people, and that was really the only way that we could have a sort of direct conversation with somebody. But it can be, it can be quite difficult. In some places, like in New Caledonia, it's not quite like New Guinea, but there are many local languages, but virtually everybody except the very oldest people in some remote areas would speak French. And so, it's possible to communicate that way. But in some areas, it is really difficult to make that, make that connection. But, sometimes that might be important to do that if one particular group is the one group that could tell you about something. So.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, every answer I have 1,000 questions more, but thank you very much. And yes, I'm thinking so much about the language related to this field. I love studying language, and sometimes I ask to myself, what should be my priorities? And it's pretty hard. Every language is a different word, I mean. So, but I just moved to the other questions.
Okay.
Because I don't want to. But the other question, maybe it can be connected, or maybe it's more related to the specific research side. Because in your career, I wanted to ask you if in your career as a researcher, has there ever been a discovery or event that completely overturned your previous ideas or assumptions? I'm not referring only to widely recognized developments nowadays, such as I saw your potential shifts, researchers about the shift of iguana phylogeny, but rather something less known that you feel deserves more attention nowadays.
That's a tough one. I can say the two things that are well known that really were life-shifting for me. Well, one may be more well known than the other. The more recent one is the kind of revolution in imagery, especially in CT scans, and the recognition that almost a single specimen could provide years of data for somebody to produce dozens of papers just from a single specimen. That ability to see inside in a way that we've never been able to see inside before really, as a morphologist, has kind of revolutionized things for me. And it's also, I think, revolutionized things for everybody, because one could say that prior to that, morphology was probably maybe not a dying science, but one that was not attracting a lot of new people to it. And I think now the imagery techniques that we have make it an exciting field. And when I go to meetings, there are many people who are involved in CT scanning or other sorts of imagery techniques that are just opening up the world. I mean, things that we never even thought could be answered can be at our fingertips. So, okay, it's not a very obscure thing. It's a major thing, but I think for me, that's been a huge thing. The other thing that happened during my career was tied into both geological advances and the development of molecular systematics in general. And that was our understanding of the age of events, evolutionary events. So sometimes that's something that pushes things back in time. And we, sort of say, well, before we thought this was something that happened in the Miocene, and now we know this happened in the Cretaceous, and this is a much older event. But the thing that affected me personally in my research is for New Caledonia. When I was a student, our understanding was New Caledonia was part of this East Gondwanan plate, and that it separated from Australia and New Zealand about 100 million years ago, and that the reptiles on New Caledonia were this ancient Gondwanan group. And subsequently, what we've learned, both from dating of molecular phylogenies, but also changes in what we know about geology, that New Caledonia was underwater for most of that time, and that all of the groups in New Caledonia radiated mostly in the last, let's say, in the last 35 million years, or even less. So we used to think that things like Rhacodactylus, the giant geckos in New Caledonia, were this ancient 100-million-year-old group. And now we know they radiated only about 12 million years ago. And so that's kind of completely changed my understanding of how evolution happened in New Caledonia, in a place where I've gone many, many times over the decades. And that has, in turn, changed my view of everything there. And I think people in New Zealand have the same experience. Moas were this ancient group, and now maybe Moas, were not there all that time, because New Zealand was largely, if not completely, underwater for a good period of this time. And those kinds of things that kind of evolve bit by bit, some from geological advances and some from what we know from using molecular techniques, they've kind of recalibrated what we know about evolution. And although maybe what we know, or what we have known about the bigger picture of evolution, hasn't changed as much, let's say, in the last 50 years, in many of these specific cases, especially for islands around the world, we now have a totally different viewpoint. And so as a student, I had to place everything in the context of these ancient Gondwanan groups. And now these are some of the youngest radiations of all geckos, which is in and of itself interesting because they're hugely morphologically diverse. And that happened overnight, really. It didn't happen over 100 million years. That happened, over 10 to 20 million years. So I think those are, again, maybe not some really unknown sort of discovery, but discoveries that really made a personal difference for me and my research, that kind of opened up a new way of thinking in the case of the CT scanning work, or caused me to have to throw away my worldview of what evolution in this corner of the world was like and reshape that based on what we know. And I think whatever the event is, or whatever the discovery is that somebody has, that has that effect, is probably a good discovery, in the sense that it puts us in our place as scientists. We recognize that we can put together these great stories and it all makes sense. But in the end, one fact or one new bit of information may reveal that this was totally unfounded. And I would just add, kind of unrelated to that, that advice that I give to people, to my students, is that is fine if the things you wrote earlier are no longer valid, because you see that there's a different history has occurred. But in the best of all possible worlds, you're the one who finds it, and you're the one who rewrites that history. So it's fine as long as somebody does it, but it's a great opportunity if you can work on something and 20 years later or 30 years later, you're the one who rewrites that history. You recognize your own mistakes and are able to incorporate the new worldview and rewrite the history that fits with the data as it stands now.
So sometimes you understand I understand that sometimes science reveal his beauty not when things go as you expect, but when are completely destroyed and you have to rebuild up something more.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And, you know, of course, it's a great reflection of the way science works. I mean, I know some people, if they describe a new species and it's later sunk into synonymy, they're disappointed. And I always think, you know, that's science. That's a hypothesis. Your new species is a hypothesis about what patterns of relationship are like. And if somebody falsifies that and comes up with a new interpretation, that's science working. That's how it's supposed to work. So I think, you know, it's also a healthier viewpoint for people, I think, to remember that there's nothing wrong with being wrong. New data changes the entire playing field, and so with those new data, new interpretations, what you did before, maybe it's supported, maybe it's not, but it's not a bad thing when those things do need to be reimagined or reevaluated.
That's great. Thank you very much. It makes me think. I would meditate on what you say to me for more and more time, because this thing reveals me new forms of speculative meditations about science. That I mean, someone that used to live with science for a career developed a deeper critical view that maybe a younger person don't have. And this critical view is what makes us younger people able to be critic with ourselves. So thank you very much. Moving to us, to the young people, what advice would you give to individuals who are deeply passionate and dream of pursuing a career like yours? Over the years, have you come to see certain academic milestones or paradigms as less important compared to other values or lessons of life maybe you have learned to prioritize?
Well, I think the advice that I would give is persistence is the most important thing. I think I always tell my advisees, and I warn them that I might be giving them bad advice in terms of their life, but if you know what you want to do, if you have that passion, you owe it to yourself to follow that passion. To me, the saddest thing I ever see is when I have advisees that have a clear interest in something, but usually somebody else has convinced them, oh, you won't be able to make a living doing that, or that's too difficult a field, or something like this. And it's, to me, very sad, because I do think, you know, you regret the things you never tried, not so much the things that you tried and maybe weren't successful with. But if you spend your whole life thinking, I really wanted to do that and I never did it, you know. So I think that persistence, the attitude I had growing up was, I knew from the time I was about 5 that I wanted to be a herpetologist. I didn't know what a herpetologist was, but I wanted to work with reptiles. And luckily for me, nobody in my life ever said, that's a bad idea, or that's not something you can make a living at, or nobody ever introduced doubt to me. And so that was my plan. And I kind of moved forward with that. And I think there are many, 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 many people who are brighter than I am and have more skill than I have, but I do have a lot of persistence, you know, and so I think that counts for something, that being willing to do whatever it takes. And in some cases that affects things in your life. So for example, at least in the United States, there are thankfully quite a few jobs in herpetology. But one of the things you can't really do is say, I like where I live right now, and that's where I'm going to stay the rest of my life. You have to be able to say, I'm motivated by my passion for this work, and if that means I have to move here, that's where I have to move. So you have to be flexible, but not only persistent, but I think you need to be flexible in order to meet those goals. And if you're not flexible, maybe that's telling you something about your level of passion for what you're doing, right? I mean, if it's an all-consuming passion, if it's your career, if this is what you really want to do, you have to be willing to do really whatever it takes to make that happen. So I think that those are things that are things that I would advice that I would give to people in terms of kind of traditional milestones. And I think that one thing that has changed over time is I would like to think that our field has become more of a meritocracy, and that it's less important who you are and where you got your training than that you are good at what you do. And that, so you do need obviously qualifications, because so many positions would require that you have certain qualifications on paper, but there are different ways that you could get that. So I would say maybe in the US many years ago, if you wanted to be sure of getting a good job, you needed to get your degree from the top universities. But I think today, people who go to maybe less well-known places, if they're good at what they do, have just as good an opportunity to succeed. And I think that that's made a difference. The other thing I think that didn't used to be true that much, you look at the literature in the early 20th century, or even the mid 20th century, or even 30 or 40 years ago, there were a lot of single author papers. And you look today, there are relatively few single author papers in herpetology or in zoology broadly, because things have become much more integrated and much more networked, and not everybody can know everything. And so if you're a morphologist, you probably will have to team up with a molecular systematist, or if you're a paleontologist, you may need to team up with a neontologist to answer certain questions. And I think in that world, in the world where interactions and networkings are so critical, that the advice I would give is develop a special skill set that is indispensable, a skill set that other people need, because that then guarantees that you will be in demand as a collaborator, that you will have opportunities to maybe expand beyond what your initial interests were by cooperating with other people. So I think that on the one hand, although I started this interview by talking about how important I think it is to be a generalist and to know a broad range of things, I think it's also important to make sure that you have at least one skill that is something that really you're in demand for. People will want that skill. They will need that skill. And that could be a lab-based skill. It could be you're an excellent field person. I think over time, for me, my students now know more techniques than I know in the lab, and analytical techniques than I know. And I'm not as fast in the field as I used to be and all, but what I can bring is I know a bunch. There's a lot of things that I know, and historical information and information that I've gathered over the years working in collections and working in the field. But whatever it is, you want to have something that you can bring to the table that makes other people want to work with you. So I think those are the things. Everybody can work on being persistent and being willing to make choices that will allow them to progress in their field. And everybody can figure out what their own particular skills are, and really shop those around. Make it clear to people that you have something that you can bring. Because it's very difficult today for people to have an entire career where they only publish by themselves. I mean, it's almost impossible today for you to do that. So I think that you have your own area of expertise, but then you can have satellite areas that your expertise plays into that allows you to have this broad connectivity to your colleagues. And that increases your productivity. It increases the number of papers that you have, and it increases your access to people, skills, places around the world. So I think that's something in general that everybody can do. Advice that I think, would apply to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was thinking, like, the skills that you mentioned, maybe they can be also external, but complementary to the science. For example, when I love so much herpetology. I want to make my life part of the herpetology, and I don't know to make it real, but I just try, and I use it as an example. The childs, when they try to walk, they always fall down. But at the end of all, I have the faith that I will be able to walk. And I'm talking about the skills that can be useful. I used to take time. Sorry if I talk so much, but I used to take time during my degree because I have other passions and I want to connect them. And in this work that is focused only in a thing, people usually used to criticize me like, Francesco, don't paint, because I love painting so much. I'm son of a painter, and I had some mentors in the art, and it's very important. You can't unify art with science in an effective way. Or I used to to take more years to do my undergraduate program because I loved so much certain languages that I wanted to learn them and to speak them and to read the books in that languages. And now I want, and when you learn 1 or 2 languages, you want to learn other 3 or 4. And these skills, I understood that these skills maybe can be useful, but when it can be a problem, when I take more years, when it can be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think, those sorts of skills are certainly a benefit. I think when it becomes a problem is when either you yourself feel or other people feel that your interests are so diffuse that you can't really push ahead in any one of them. You're so interested in everything that nothing moves, which could be a very satisfying life, but probably not a very satisfying career in a particular thing. But I think those are, as you said, like languages. When I was in high school, I took French, German, and Latin because those were things I could take. And I use those every day. I use all 3 of those every day. And I think one of the times where you recognize how useful those kinds of related skills are is when I have people who come to me and say, oh, could you translate this for me? Or can you, and it's extra work, but I feel like those years I invested are worthwhile because I'm using them myself, but I can use them for other people. Those sorts of things are certainly things that can come into play, I think, as one moves forward. They count just as much as, having some particular analytical ability being able to access the literature, or being able to, have a certain perspective that you wouldn't have without having some other experience. Those things are still very important. And I think as long as one is keeping an eye on, this is where I want my career to go, how can I use my other interests to help with that, it allows you to explore those other interests, but not be so scattered that you appear from the outside to have no focus. Because this is certainly a thing, and I think many people experience that. If you have a lot of interests, when you get evaluated, people might say, well, yeah, you publish good work and you do nice things, but well, I don't see the focus. I don't see what the focus of your research is. So I think one needs to find a way that you can make the best use of those other interests so that they play into your career, play into your major interests. And that doesn't, there's no need to give up languages or give up painting or give up literature or whatever it might be. The desired outcome is to find a way that they can inform what you're doing.
Thank you very much. If you say to me, it's more important because, when we take some lessons from someone, it's important. Einstein used to say something similar, like, if you want to learn how to swim, ask to a fish, not to a squirrel. To a squirrel, you should ask how to go on the top of the trees. And it's easy. It's maybe ridiculous if I say it this way, but it's definitely difficult in the true life. And so we arrived to the last questions, but I think every single question is related to previous 4 questions. But so for students who are deeply passionate about your work and eager to learn as much as possible from you, what opportunities might be to engage with you or benefit from your guidance? Would you be willing to offer such opportunities, or does your university provide any programs or initiatives through which aspiring naturalists could learn directly from you?
So I'm always open to questions, and I encourage people to contact me. I get about 200 emails a day, every day, and probably five of those emails on average are somebody who I've never met before who's contacting me to ask me about something, ask me about something that I have had experience with. So I'm always happy to respond. So I would encourage people to feel comfortable reaching out. I mean, I think for me, this was a big thing when I was a student and I went to Europe for 3 months to visit museums, and I encountered people like Wolfgang Böhme in Bonn, who was a senior, well-respected herpetologist, and I was a new graduate student, but he was so open and willing to help and answer questions, and it was very encouraging. And so I've tried to take that to heart and recognize how important it can be for somebody who's just starting to feel comfortable going to somebody that they've never met and saying, hey, this is who I am and this is what my interests are, and can you point me in the right direction, or can we discuss something? So one, I would encourage people, if they have an interest in the things that I know about or the things I'm interested in, they're more than welcome to contact me. Sometimes there are opportunities, like in my lab, we do a number of field trips every year, and I've had students from other institutions that contacted me that joined our field trips. Most recently, several different people who joined several African field trips who had nothing to do with my university or with my program, but We had an email correspondence, and they seemed very interested, and they thought that they would get something out of it, and so we arranged for them to be able to come to the field and work on some of these organisms. So there's opportunities like that. My university, Villanova, has a contact form. It's called, I think, something like Contact an Expert, and if you look up, I get some contacts because it just lists people and what their areas of expertise are. And so sometimes people start these connections by, they type into Google, a question about herpetology or a question about New Caledonia or about Africa or whatever, and it is picked up by Villanova's system and automatically goes to my, Ask an Expert thing. So there's that. And then we also have at my institution something called CBEST, which is the Center for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stewardship, which are the faculty in my department and other departments who are interested in those kinds of questions. Ecologists who are interested in ecosystems, and then biodiversity people like myself and several of my colleagues. And we have periodic events that we share with the community or with people from the outside who we know might be interested. Some of those are virtual events that are online, so people could join for that. We've done some things about local biodiversity here, but we also bring in people from the outside to talk about different topics. I brought in colleagues from different places around the world to talk about their research. And that's another opportunity, especially via a virtual connection for people who are far away, where they could interact. But the first step, I think, is just kind of reaching out. And some people, are good correspondents about that sort of thing, and will try to get back to people. And other people are not so good. And it doesn't mean that they're not interested, but just sometimes it's just not the way people operate. But I will feel guilty if I have an email from somebody and I don't respond and at least say, yes, I think I can help you, or let's, plan a Zoom, or let's talk about this. I feel it was important for me when I was a student, and so I try to keep that in mind and try to encourage people to feel free to contact me. So unless somebody sends me something that's obviously a broadcast spam thing that says, I'm working on the molecular genetics of this fungus, I'd like to work in your lab, those I will ignore because it's clear that it's just a broadcast message. But if it's something where somebody has a specific interest or question, I always try to respond and give them whatever encouragement I can. And occasionally I actually do have people that come and visit. I've had people come from mostly from Europe, but also other parts of the world who, have come to visit for a week. We talk about projects and maybe try to get a project going that we can collaborate on, those sorts of things. Or since I travel a lot, if I'm going to their city or their country, try to get together and try to establish some sort of connection. So I do think that, I do make an effort to try and be as supportive as I can for people who have a passion about the same sorts of things that I have a passion about. So the first step is send me an email, and I will respond. And if it looks like there's something that would be useful for you, then we can follow it up from there.
Thank you very much. It was so important, but for us that what you did for me or for us, me representing all the people, me representing people in general that love what they are doing, but they know what they want to do, but they don't know how to do it. What you are doing for us is something that we will never forgive. And but not only that, it's also an existentialist example of how we should be if we realize ourselves. to make other people able to be what they want to be. And so it's something that goes on during time, and it's so beautiful. So thank you very much from my heart.
Sure, I'm happy to help when I can, and yeah, I mean that's really the legacy that you have. I mean, you publish papers and you have your own students, but you know, it's that downstream influence that you have on people that you know, even if there's one person in your career that you influenced enough that they went on and had a successful career of their own, you know, that's a rewarding thing, you know, and if it's more than one, that's great. But I think, you know, that's something that over time, I think everybody learns to appreciate more and more, that it's not just what you produce, but it's, you know, how you've influenced other people. And as I said, I think I'm always positive about people in herpetology and people in field biology and zoology in general. I just think, you know, it's been a wonderful career for me. It's given me so many opportunities and so many experiences. You know, I just find it rewarding if somebody else can follow that path and have that same experience.
Thank you very much. It was so very important for me. It will be in the future because I will try to put in my mind all the things that you say to me. So thank you very much for the, I don't know how many times I said it, but I continue to say. Thank you very much. I stopped okay.